I will be talking about a topic I have been working on for about 4 years, I think. I have currently a project, FVF project, so funded by Austria, on late fertility across Europe. And part of the results I will be presenting are from that project. And as Anna was saying, I recently got an ERC grant, consolidator grant. And at the end of the talk, I will be introducing that new project. So you will see how it links to my previous research and to the general research questions about fertility today. And so I will start. First, I will give you an overview of late fertility as well as late fertility intentions, and I will contrast that by parity and by level of education. And then I will speak a bit about what the problem is at later ages. So if people want to postpone, what can happen? What can be the constraints that they can meet while postponing? And notably, one of the questions would be, could biological factors become increasingly important for future fertility levels? And then I will ask two questions. So is there still room for fertility postponement, which is more on my current project? And then which are the factors that push to have baby or that prevent from having babies at later ages? And that's my future ERC project, Big Late. I have co-authors and I really want to acknowledge their work. Particularly here, I will be presenting some work with Tomasz Sobotka, and that I have done well in Australia with Anna Raimondos and other persons. And from time to time, I do things alone as well. So there will be also some things that I have done alone. But well, just, you know, that's also some group work. So we have witnessed a huge, remarkable increase in late childbearing. So here it's from age 40 across Europe, and I'm also showing the US here and Japan here. So in 1985 is in blue, and 2018, the most recent period, and that's the share of the fertility rates that are attributed to women who are age 40 or above. And so what we can see here, we can see several groups, and particularly we can see that in the south of Europe, there has been a huge, there is a huge number of births that are linked to, that are due to late mothers. And at the other extreme, more in the east of Europe, we see still quite low levels of late fertility. And I'm showing you here Austria because I will be speaking a lot about Austria. It's in the middle range, let's say. Japan has had a huge increase. So it was among the ones that had the lowest share of late birth, and now it's really increased a lot. And it's on a very, you know, steep slope of increase of late fertility. Okay, so that's for the overview. Another thing that has increased is the wish to have a child late. So women have been postponing childbearing, they have their children later and later, and we can expect, of course, that there are more and more women who want to have a child late. And what hasn't been done a lot is to quantify the proportion of persons who actually want a child quite late. So here I'm showing the way the share of women who want a child at age 40, 42 changed over time in Austria, and that's by parity. So in orange, that's childless women. So the share of childless women who want a child. In 1986, it was about 4%. In 2016, it was about 30% of childless women at age 40-42 who still wanted a child. If you look at those who have one child, there has been also an increase. For those who have 2 or more children already, there has been much less of an increase. Also because most of them have already reached the family size they would like to have. So overall, that's we really see that there's today a very large share of women who are childless at age 40-42 who want to have a child even on the same definition as in 1986. So there has been changes. And now I offer a cross-sectional picture because I don't have such trends for all countries, because that's data that are incredibly difficult to find. But in a cross-country picture, we can also see that in many countries, the share of women who still want a child at age, so here it's age 40-44, is quite large, and it's everywhere in the, not everywhere significantly, but it's in most countries, it's quite higher for women who still don't have any child. So here you can see, for instance, Austria, France, and Italy. They are between 20 and 35% of childless women who want a child at age 40-44. And it's much less again for higher parities. And I also have here 2 countries of the east of Europe, among which Poland. And what we see here is actually, because they are much less advanced in the process of postponement, there are not yet many people who wish to have a child late. And I suspect there may be more and more, because when we look at trends, it's really, they are really on a slope, like accelerating slope of postponement and increase in late fertility. Okay. And then I'm also showing by level of education, but focusing only on women who have no child or one child, so as to select those, who overall are more likely to have a wish to have a child. And I also had to have a wider age group, otherwise I wouldn't have a sample large enough. But by having these women 35-44 and without a child or with one child, we see that by level of education, there is also a contrast in the share of women who want a child at later ages. That's of course expected, but that's very clear, and we also have numbers here. So for instance, that 50% of highly educated still want a child. In Austria and in Italy, it's 60% in that age group. So it's quite substantial proportions. Okay. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say here, again, in the East, we see much less contrast between levels of education. Also, probably for the same reason that there is really not yet much late fertility. So, a bit on why this may happen, like postponement and late fertility. So there was a rise in the first birth rates, and these women, in fact, who had these children later were in fact women who did not have children at earlier ages, most of them, because they spent a longer time studying, or because there was economic uncertainty and more youth unemployment. And also it's possible because they had competing activities. On the other hand, there are also new reasons to have children late. For instance, there's longer life expectancy, and there's a change in partnership and repartnering behavior. Notably, you know, there are more first unions that are broken up without having any child. So that can have quite an important, that can have repercussions on the share of children, of persons who want and have a child at later ages. And finally, there was always, like, there's this change in value and attitudes that can be driving postponement as well as recuperation and as well as the acceptance of having children late. So that's an important feature. And what about this problem at later ages? So the thing is that that's the ability to give birth to a live child depending on the age. And that's lots of curves that have been calculated by people over time. And that's based on historical populations. But basically in all these populations, they found that the probability, the chances to give birth to a live child was decreasing with age, and that the decrease was starting around age 30, 35, and really becoming much steeper around age 40. So in the late 30s and from age 40. So there's so that's one of the aspects that there are biological limits to fertility. And there has been also, related to that, an increase in the share of live birth resulting from IVF. And we see here that there was, so that's with own eggs, so it's in blue, and that's the percent of all live births above age 35 here that take place. And so what we can see here, we see that with age, there's an increase in the births by IVF, in the proportion of births by IVF, but that there's also an increase in the share of these births that are from donor eggs. So as you can see here, so let's say IVF can be helpful, but from some age, it's more likely that you'll have to use donor eggs if you want to have a child. And finally, despite all these postponements and so on, so you can see here in the example of Sweden, there was a large increase in births at age 40 up to age 43. But you know, it's difficult for births at higher ages to increase. But the interesting thing here is that there was a new group that appeared of births, and that's births at age 47, 52. So before there were almost none, and now there are some. And that can be attributed to these IVF with donor eggs, notably. So that's quite an interesting change in late fertility and in fertility today. But here, for instance, in 2018, that was representing only 30 births. So it's not many births anyway. So what I want to say with that is that we can't really rely on in vitro fertilization for having the children that we can't have because of the decrease in fertility with age. And here you can see that the success rate of IVF, like fertility and like the fertility curves I was showing you, decreases with age. So it's here. in blue. And if you include donor eggs, then you can have some kind of flat line. So meaning if you accept to use donor eggs, then you can have these children at later ages. So that's the what happens as a consequence of this postponement, and that's not only biological, but so what happens as a summary of what we said. In fact, there's the share of women who still say they don't want a child at age 35, 39 has not changed much over time. So around age 35, 39, it's always about 10% of women in Austria who don't want a child. But the share of childless women at age 44 has increased quickly. And so there's what I call here an increasing share of women who are childless and who don't intend it. So here before it was about 4% who were childless, while the expected childlessness was around 10%. But now there is 8% who are unexpectedly childless in this estimation over time. So what this says is that there is sorry, I will close my email box because I realize that it's making noises. Okay, so that's the one of the points that I want to make, that with postponement, there hasn't been less women wanting to have children late. There has been more women wanting to have children late, but there has been an increasing share of them who actually did not have the children that they wanted. Okay, so which consequences of fertility postponement? So for individuals, men and women who do not succeed in having children they desire often experience psychological distress, and particularly for a first child. And they also have experienced more complex path to childbirth because they have to go through assisted reproduction, and also they can have to decide whether they want to use donor eggs, which is also, a new type of decision people can have to make. And then it seems so highly educated women are particularly affected by this, by fertility postponement and wanting to have children late. And also, finally, the old age is a risk factor for pregnancy outcome. So that's important to take into account when we know that there are more and more women who try to have children late. But on the other hand, children of later parents often fare better. So that's often the two sides of the coin that are shown in papers on the consequences of late childbearing. And what can be the consequences for fertility levels? So there's a potential slowdown of fertility, and particularly for higher order birth, because women have their first child late and then the second, but will they really have the third one, knowing that they are already 42 or 43? The later they start, and the more the higher order birth have chances to be prevented. And also one can wonder, and that's what I will talk about now, how important are the circumstances and the context as compared to the biological constraints. So, is there still room for fertility postponement? So that's, first I start with the individual level, I would say. So what I'm showing here in black, so it's let's say, to simplify, it's the share of women who said, I really want a child within 3 years, and who actually did have a child within 3 years. So that's a calculation we did in Australia with the Australian data. And so that's by age. And so we see that around until age 30, there were about 70% of those who had said, I really want a child within 3 years who would have it. But then as we went to age 30 and above, there's a steep decrease in the share of women who actually have the child that they want, and about a quarter have it at age 38, 41 in Australia. And of course, there can be some selection, and that's cross-sectional, so that's not ideal, it's not following a cohort, but that already gives, you know, an instinct of the decrease. And also we showed that in several other countries with my co-author Zuzanna Borczewska. So that's something that's really observed across civilizations. And then what I added here in yellow for comparison is this physiological capacity to have a child that I was showing earlier, and that's decreasing with age. So I don't go up to age 50 like before, so it doesn't look so terrible. But so what you can see here is that at age 29, 31, there's about 25% difference between these two curves. So, but at age 38, 41, there's a 42% difference between these two curves. So whatever the reasons, it seems that women are less likely to realize their fertility, and they are also getting farther away from their physiological capacity. So meaning that at later ages, there are also other circumstances that seem to intervene. That could be individual circumstances that play differently, or the role of the context or of norms that have more influence at later ages. And women say, no, I won't have a child, finally, doesn't matter, or, you know, they would change their mind and so on. So there's an interesting, really interesting shift across ages to study here and to understand what are the reasons why this gap is growing. Though, as I told you, there are selection effects and so on. So, but even though there are countries where it's decreasing even more. Okay, and so at the country level now, so what I would like to say is that, you know, we see that with age, so as women postpone individually, they become less and less likely to have children. So one can wonder, well, and across countries then, maybe the more people postpone in the country, and the more fertility will decline. So that's, you know, the most instinctive deduction from an individual level observation. And then it's the opposite. So it's in the countries where there was most postponement that fertility is actually remaining the highest. So that's what this graph is showing here. So we have a whole paper on that if you want to read it. So, but basically that's the main result, you know. And still, I want to speak about Italy and Spain. Because unfortunately, in Italy and Spain, there was lots of postponement. They really postponed a lot. And there was also quite a large decrease in fertility. And in many other instances, they have very high late fertility, and they have very, and so they have these. And so because of all these observations, it looks like Italy and Spain are becoming more and more constrained. So that maybe in Italy and Spain we would observe that individual deduced relationship between fertility and fertility levels and age at childbearing. But that's exactly the type of things that we have to investigate. But that's really the conclusion here still is that since there's this positive trend, it still means that the context dominates these biological constraints so far in most countries. So, and that where there is a good context for having children, even those who were postponing were having children. And where there was less, incentives to have children, or where there was less good context, then there wouldn't be such an increase. Okay, so as a summary of this part, there still seems to be some room for fertility postponement. So as I was showing at the contextual level, at the country level, the context could still play a role, and biological factors didn't seem to be really prevalent in changing fertility levels. It has still become clear that in many countries where we were expecting that there would be recuperation, there has been not so much recuperation, or there has been just a bit of recuperation. There has been less recuperation as there had been postponement. So hence a fertility decrease in general within cohorts. So that's another paper that we're writing now. And I spoke about Italy and Spain. And for individuals, as I was showing you, individual circumstances seem very important for having or not children late. I didn't say it, but I did also the same for only people who were in a partnership. And we were also getting the same results, that there was a very strong decrease across ages. And so they may have the first child they wish, so at the end of the day, individuals, but less often further children because they were starting too late. And they may have to use more often IVF and use a donor eggs. And so overall, I would say that biological factors will certainly become increasingly important for future fertility levels. And we are currently with my colleague Maria Winkler-Dvorak, we're currently setting up a microsimulation to try to better investigate these mechanisms I was speaking about earlier. Notably, there is Italy in that microsimulation, so we hope that we'll have interesting results to try to understand whether women seem constrained by age limits. Okay, so now I make a tiny break. I breathe, and I will finish on introducing my project. So let's say one of the key sentences that represents what the project is talking about is that the desire and ability of those who did not have children in their 20s to have them later, which is called fertility recuperation, are decisive for future fertility levels and for life satisfaction among those who wish to have children. So by this sentence, I mean that it has become over the change in fertility at earlier ages, it has become really important that we understand why women are having children later, because most women in the close future will have their children later. So it's really important to understand why, not why, to understand whether they will have them and which are the factors that can influence whether they have them. And so Anne Barrington was already speaking about that in 2004 in a paper, and saying further research is required to investigate the extent to which those who did not achieve a birth, the perpetual postponers, were unable to for biological reasons as opposed to social or economic constraints. And in the meanwhile, there has been a few attempts to look at that, but there hasn't really been much focus on these conditions at later ages. And everything I was talking earlier about biological reasons, context, and individual circumstances. And so that's what I'm planning to study in the BIC project. So BIC stands for biological, individual, and contextual. And so these factors would be those that could either, help fertility recuperation, or that could prevent fertility recuperation. First, there are the biological factors, so that's this decrease I was showing you. And the idea is to also look at men. And then individual factors, so such as partnership and separation, repartnering, and also health status, work status, and alternative commitments that can take place at later ages. For instance, people can have got more involved into activities that are taking lots of their time, and they like doing that, and they don't really feel the need to have a child. So that's things that we can explore. And then contextual factors, so because there is still some, there can still be norms about social age at parenthood and late parenthood, as well as about the use of assisted reproduction. And so that's what we explore across countries, as well as the economic situation, the welfare state, and compatibility of work and family life, and gender equality. So that's for the contextual factors. And so overall, I won't tell you everything about Big Lake, but just this. It will give insights on the effects of these three types of factors for fertility at these recuperation ages. And we'll try to quantify as far as we can, at least for the biological factors for sure, and to compare how much they are important. And then the project will embed knowledge on sterility and assisted reproduction into fertility research, because there is some, but there is further studies that can really be done on infertility and ART use and link it to fertility and fertility levels. And also in the project, we consider that fertility is driven by different factors depending on the age. And I think that it's quite different from what is usually thought of, like we look at all women together, but it's possible that younger women have different drives than older women. And so we will be always looking at that separately. Okay, and particularly if we want to study the contextual factors, we can look at them at younger ages and at older ages and see whether it differs. And finally, the project will link the conditions at the time of fertility recuperation to today's and tomorrow's cohort fertility levels. So that will be across the postponing countries. And in fact, that's scenarios for the future. And we'll be putting a few scenarios of how assisted reproduction could change, or of how the context could change, and we'll try to do a few projections of the future fertility levels within cohorts. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.